The smell hit first. Acrid and bitter, the ghost of melted plastic and burnt rubber clinging to the damp morning air in the stairwell. It was a chemical smell, an unnatural violation of the usual scent of stale cigarettes and boiled cabbage that defined the building. Sarah held her 7-year-old daughter, Lily, against her hip, her own body a trembling shield against a harm that had already been done. Lily wasn't screaming. The sound she made was worse, a series of choked, hiccuping sobs that seemed to tear at the delicate architecture of her small chest. Her face was buried in Sarah's neck, her tiny hands clutching the fabric of her mother's worn sweatshirt. On the concrete landing outside apartment 3B, just inches from their door, lay the evidence. It was a blackened, misshapen lump, a grotesque sculpture of what, only yesterday, had been a pair of sneakers. Pink, sparkly, light-up sneakers. The left shoe was still vaguely recognizable, its sole curled upward like a dying leaf, a single plastic star grotesquely warped by the heat. The right was a fused mass of molten goo. They were the one new thing Lily owned. At the bottom of the narrow staircase, leaning against the peeling paint of the opposite wall, stood Mr. Alistair Finch. He was a man whose physical softness, the doughy face, the gentle paunch beneath his cheap suit, was contradicted by the hard, flat look in his eyes. He held a small, butane torch in one hand, the kind used for plumbing, its nozzle still faintly shimmering with heat. He made no effort to hide it. A smirk played on his lips, a subtle twitch that conveyed a deep and satisfying sense of power. "Fire hazard," he said, his voice a calm, reasonable tenor that was more chilling than any shout. "Items left in the common area. It's in the lease agreement. Section 12, subsection C. Had to be done." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She could feel the vibrations of Lily's quiet weeping travel through her own body. She looked from the melted shoes to Finch's placid, cruel face. There was no remorse there, only ownership. He owned the building, the stairs, the air they were breathing. He owned their fear. From somewhere far down the street, the low, percussive rumble of a single motorcycle engine briefly tore through the quiet, a sound that registered only in the periphery of her hearing before it faded, a premonition she could not yet understand. Finch's smirk widened slightly, as if he knew a secret she didn't. "You should keep a cleaner hallway, Mrs. Jensen." For the girl's safety, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing a final, unassailable authority down the hall, leaving Sarah and Lily alone with the toxic smell of a lesson brutally taught. Lily finally lifted her head, her face blotchy and streaked with tears. Her voice was a tiny, broken whisper. "They burned my shoes," she cried. "He burned the lights." The precinct waiting room felt like a purgatory of beige plastic and flickering fluorescent lights. The air was thick with the scent of cheap coffee and disinfectant. After 2 hours, a man whose name tag read Officer Miller called her name. He listened to her story with a practiced air of weary patience, his pen scratching lazy circles on a notepad. "So he burned the shoes," he repeated, his tone flat, devoid of surprise or concern. "On the landing, outside your door." He looked up at her, his eyes conveying the full weight of bureaucratic inertia. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but this is a civil matter. It's a landlord-tenant dispute." He tore a page from his pad, scribbled a phone number on it, and pushed it across the counter. "You can file a report in small claims court. That's the proper venue for property damage." Sarah stared at him, a knot of disbelief tightening in her stomach. "He did it to threaten us, to scare my daughter." It wasn't just about the shoes, Miller sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of a man at the end of a long shift. "Do you have proof he was threatening you? Did he say, 'I'm going to hurt you'? Or did he say it was a fire hazard?" Sarah's shoulders slumped. "He said it was a fire hazard. Then it's his word against yours. Without a direct threat, it's destruction of property." Small claims. He handed her a pamphlet, its glossy surface covered in clip art of smiling families and gavels. The system had spoken. Her fear was not a crime. Her daughter's tears were a civil matter. Her next stop was the city's housing authority, a monolithic concrete building downtown that seemed designed to intimidate. A woman sat behind a thick pane of plexiglass, her voice muffled by a cheap intercom. She listened to Sarah's story with the same detached professionalism as the police officer, her expression unchanging. "Did Mr. Finch provide you with a written notice of violation regarding personal items in the hallway prior to this incident?" The question was a trap, and Sarah knew it. "No. He never said a word about them before." The woman's sigh was barely audible through the speaker. "That complicates his position, but it doesn't automatically make it a criminal act." She slid a thick packet of forms through the slot at the bottom of the window. "You'll need to file a formal complaint. Form 7C, for landlord harassment. We'll open an investigation." Sarah clutched the packet. Felt as heavy as a tombstone. "How long will that take?" The woman's gaze was unflinching. "Our current caseload is significant. Once the file is opened, it could be 6 to 8 months before an inspector is assigned. 6 to 8 months. An eternity. They had to live there on that landing under that man's authority for 6 to 8 more months. The system was not a shield. It was a labyrinth. Its walls were not made of brick, but of forms, procedures, and delays. It was a structure built to absorb screams until they became whispers, and then silence. As Sarah walked out of the building, the heavy glass doors closing behind her, she felt a profound sense of isolation. She was a single voice in a vast, indifferent machine, and the machine was not designed to listen. Apartment 3B was small, just 2 rooms and a kitchenette, but Sarah had made it a sanctuary. The walls were painted a soft yellow, a color she'd chosen to fight back against the building's oppressive grayness. Lily's crayon drawings, of sons with smiling faces, lopsided houses, and a stick-figure portrait of the 2 of them holding hands, were taped to the refrigerator, a vibrant gallery of a 7-year-old's world. This tiny space was the sum total of their kingdom, defended by the meager income from Sarah's 2 jobs. From 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, she was a waitress at the Greasy Spoon Diner, her life a whirlwind of coffee pots, sticky syrup dispensers, and the practiced smile she wore like a uniform. From 7 in the evening until midnight, she cleaned empty offices in the sterile, silent towers downtown, pushing a vacuum across acres of corporate carpeting, the solitude a welcome respite. Sleep came in fractured intervals. The light-up sneakers had been a birthday gift from her older brother, Frank. He was a long-haul trucker, a man who measured his life in miles and lived through a telephone line. He'd sent them in a cardboard box, along with a $20 bill tucked into a card. They were more than shoes. They were a symbol of a world beyond their cramped apartment, a world of birthday wishes and frivolous joy. Sarah remembered the moment Lily opened the box. Her gasp of pure, unadulterated delight was a sound Sarah had mentally recorded, a treasure she kept for the hard days. Lily had treated the shoes with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics. She would only wear them for special occasions, a trip to the park, a visit to the library. Each night, she would wipe them clean with a damp cloth and place them neatly by the door, ready for the next adventure. She loved the way the red and blue lights embedded in the soles flashed with every step, a tiny, personal light show that announced her presence to the world. They made her feel fast, powerful, magical. To Sarah, the shoes represented a small victory, a proof that despite the constant struggle, she could still provide a sliver of magic for her daughter. Seeing them as a melted ruin on the concrete was not just about the loss of a possession. It was a desecration. It was Finch reaching into their small, carefully constructed world and proving he had the power to extinguish its light, to melt its magic into a foul-smelling lump of plastic. He hadn't just burned a pair of shoes. He had burned a piece of Lily's childhood. He had taken a symbol of love and family and turned it into an instrument of fear. And that was a debt Sarah didn't know how the world could ever repay. The days that followed were a slow, creeping poison. Fear, once a visitor, became a resident in apartment 3B. It lived in the creak of the floorboards in the hallway, in the rattle of the pipes, in the sound of Finch's heavy footsteps on the stairs. He never spoke to them again, but his presence was a constant, oppressive weight. The harassment became a campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts. One morning, The hot water in their shower ran cold after 2 minutes. When Sarah called the building's management number, which she knew rang on a phone in Finch's own apartment, he answered with feigned surprise. "The boiler must be acting up again. I'll have a guy look at it next week." Next week never came. The water remained lukewarm at best. Then a notice appeared on their door, a crisp white envelope tucked under the handle. It was an official-looking letter, announcing a market-rate rent adjustment, effective the 1st of the month. The new amount was nearly double what she was paying, a figure so impossibly high it was laughable and terrifying. It was an eviction notice masquerading as a rent increase. Sarah knew it was illegal. She called the housing authority again. "Yes, Mrs. Jensen," the voice on the phone said, dripping with bureaucratic fatigue. "I see your file here. The still pending review. An illegal rent increase should be noted in your file. Please send us a copy of the notice." She sent it. Another piece of paper fed into the void. The system documented her pain but did nothing to stop it. The worst part was the way he watched her. When she left for work in the morning, he would be standing in the lobby, polishing the brass mailboxes, his eyes following her as she scurried past. When she came home late at night, exhausted and smelling of industrial cleaner, his apartment door would be slightly ajar, a sliver of light cutting across the dark hallway, and she could feel his gaze on her back as she fumbled with her keys. One afternoon, she went to get the mail and found the lock on their box 3B had been jammed. A tiny, almost invisible drop of superglue had been carefully applied, sealing it shut. It was a meticulous, patient act of cruelty. She called the police again. A different officer, this one sounding younger and even more disinterested, took the report over the phone. "You have any witnesses who saw him do it?" "No, but who else would it be?" "Ma'am, without a witness or a confession, there's nothing we can do. I can send a patrol car to drive by the area when one becomes free, but I can't make any promises no car ever came." The feeling of being hunted was relentless. Sarah started taking different routes home from the bus stop. She taught Lily a game called Quiet as a Mouse, which they played whenever they were in the building's common areas. She began documenting everything, writing in a spiral notebook with a shaking hand. The date the water went cold, the time she saw him watching her, the discovery of the glued mailbox. It was a diary of terror. The system had failed her. The law was a distant, abstract concept. In the suffocating confines of the building on Elm Street, Alistair Finch was the only law that mattered, and his justice was arbitrary and cruel. Sarah felt herself shrinking, becoming smaller and quieter, a ghost in her own life, haunted by the fear of what he might do next. The world had become a very small, very dangerous place. On a Tuesday night, huddled on her sofa long after Lily had fallen into a restless sleep, Sarah finally broke. She called her brother. The phone rang 4 times before Frank answered, his voice a low rumble against the background hiss of an open highway. "Hey, Sar, everything okay?" She tried to keep her voice steady, to downplay the gnawing panic. "Hey, Frank. Yeah, everything's fine. Just calling to check in." But her voice was a thin, brittle thing, and he heard the fracture in it immediately. He knew her better than anyone. "What is it?" he asked, his tone shifting from casual to concerned. "What's wrong?" And with that simple question, the dam burst. The carefully constructed walls of her composure crumbled, and the story poured out of her. Not in a torrent, but in a halting, choked whisper. She told him about the landlord, the constant watching, the cold water, the illegal rent notice, the glued mailbox. She told him about the police reports that went nowhere and the housing complaints lost in a bureaucratic swamp. And then, her voice cracking, she told him about the shoes. "He burned her shoes, Frank?" she whispered into the phone, the words themselves feeling like ash in her mouth. "He took Lily's new light-up sneakers and he burned them with a torch, right outside our door." She could hear the air conditioner in her window rattle, the distant wail of a siren, the frantic beating of her own heart. On the other end of the line, there was only silence. For a full 30 seconds, the only sound was the crackle of static and the faint roar of his truck's engine devouring miles of dark asphalt somewhere in Nebraska or Wyoming. He was listening. He was processing. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. The warmth was gone, replaced by something cold and hard and heavy, like steel. "There are rules, Sarah," he said, his words deliberate and measured. "There are lines. A man doesn't cross certain lines." He wasn't talking about the law on the books. He was talking about an older, more fundamental code. You can have a problem with another man, you handle it. You can have a problem with a woman, you back the hell off. But you don't mess with a man's family. And you never, ever hurt a kid. You don't make a child cry. Frank was a member of the Iron Sentinels motorcycle club. To the outside world, they were rough men on loud machines. But within their circle, they were bound by a strict code of honor, a fiercely protected brotherhood. And that code had an inviolable tenet. An attack on a child was an attack on them all. It was the one sin that demanded a response. "He burned her shoes," Frank repeated, his voice a low growl. The act was symbolic, a piece of calculated cruelty that revealed the true nature of the man. It wasn't a landlord-tenant dispute anymore. It was a violation. "I'm making a call," Frank said, his voice now calm, decisive. "Don't you worry about a thing. We don't do things his way. We do things by the book." Our book. The call ended. Sarah sat in the darkness, the silence of her apartment suddenly feeling different. It was no longer the silence of isolation. It was the silence of a promise. A gear had turned in some distant, powerful machine, and something was now in motion. The first call was made at 5:47 a.m. from a truck stop just outside Cheyenne. Frank, standing by his rig with a cup of steaming coffee, dialed a number he knew by heart. It was answered on the second ring. "Preacher, it's Frank." The man on the other end, the president of the Iron Sentinels local chapter, was a retired Marine named David Preacher Bell. He listened without interruption as Frank laid out the situation. His voice a flat, factual recitation of Finch's campaign of terror, culminating in the story of the melted shoes. Preacher asked only two questions. "Is she safe right now?" And, "Does she have records?" Frank confirmed both. "Good," Preacher said. "Stand by." He hung up. The timestamp on the screen read 6 o'clock. Head count, 1. A phone tree, efficient and practiced as a military operation, began to branch out. Preacher's first call was to a man they called Doc, a paramedic who served as the chapter's secretary. His second was to Rhino, a bear of a man who owned a construction company. Each man, in turn, made 2 more calls. The message was simple and unadorned. Code 9. Staging at the old quarry. 9 o'clock. Dress uniform. Code 9 was the club's designation for a non-violent, public-facing action in defense of a vulnerable party. Dress uniform meant clean vests, polished boots, and a demeanor of absolute professionalism. Across the state, men stopped what they were doing. In a greasy garage on the industrial side of town, a mechanic named Gus carefully wiped his hands on a red rag, told his apprentice he had a family matter to attend to, and walked to the gleaming Harley-Davidson parked in the corner. In a suburban cul-de-sac, a high school history teacher finished his morning coffee, kissed his wife, and pulled on a leather vest over his collared shirt. On a sprawling job site, Rhino pulled his foreman aside, gave him instructions for the day, and climbed into his pickup truck, his motorcycle already loaded in the back. A veteran, sitting on his front porch watching the sun rise, received the call, nodded silently, and went inside to retrieve his vest from the closet where it hung next to his dress blues. The timestamp read 7:30. Head count, 12. Engines began to turn over, not with the aggressive, throttle-blipping roar of a gang, but with a low, synchronized rumble of purpose. At a local news station, a young, hungry investigative journalist named Maria Suarez received an anonymous text message from a burner phone. It read, "City Hall, 11 a.m. Ask Councilman Davies about the Finch Properties zoning variance for the Elm Street block. Bring a camera." She didn't know the sender, but her gut told her it was a real tip. She assigned a camera crew. By 9:15, at the abandoned quarry 10 miles outside the city, the head count was 47. They stood in a loose formation as Preacher addressed them. He didn't give a fiery speech. He laid out the facts, the same ones Frank had given him. He held up a grainy photo Frank had texted him of the melted lump of plastic and rubber. A low murmur went through the assembled men. Preacher then handed out assignments. Rhino's crew had already run a public record search on Alistair Finch, compiling a dossier on his properties, his business partners, and a history of code violations. Doc had prepared packets containing photocopies of the state's landlord-tenant laws, with relevant sections on harassment and illegal eviction highlighted in yellow. They were not preparing for a fight. They were preparing a case. They were an army of auditors and librarians, their weapons clipboards, smartphones, and the unassailable truth. At 10:55 a.m., Alistair Finch stepped out of the ornate doors of City Hall, a broad, self-satisfied smile on his face. He was shaking hands with City Councilman Davies, a portly man whose own smile was equally wide. Their meeting about Finch's lucrative zoning variance had gone well. The path was greased. The future was bright. He was thinking about the celebratory steak he would have for lunch when the sound began. It started as a low thrumming, a vibration felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. It grew steadily, a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to come from all directions at once, swallowing the ambient noise of the city. Finch and the councilman stopped, their smiles faltering as they looked down the street. 47 motorcycles turned the corner onto the plaza in front of City Hall. They moved not as a chaotic swarm, but in a perfect 2x2 staggered formation, a display of unnerving discipline. The chrome on their machines glinted in the late morning sun. They did not block traffic or run red lights. They proceeded at the speed limit, a slow, inexorable river of steel and leather. One by one, they peeled off, filling every single legal parking spot on all four sides of the city square with quiet, methodical precision. Then, as if cued by a single, silent conductor, 47 engines cut out in unison. The sudden, profound silence that followed was more jarring than the noise had been. The men dismounted, swinging their legs over their bikes with an economy of motion. They were not the wild, unkempt figures of stereotype. Their vests were clean, the iron sentinels patch on the back stark and clear. Their boots were polished. They ranged in age from their late 20s to their 60s. Their faces a mixture of calloused grit and quiet gravity. They did not speak. They did not gesture. They simply moved to the public sidewalk across the street from the City Hall entrance, forming a long, silent line. 47 men, standing shoulder to shoulder, an immovable wall of quiet observation. They did not stare at Finch. They simply stood, their collective presence creating a magnetic field of accountability. Finch's face had gone pale, the color draining from his cheeks. His self-satisfied smirk had vanished, replaced by a twitch of panic. Councilman Davies, seeing the men and the approaching news van of Maria Suarez, mumbled a hasty excuse about another meeting and practically ran back inside the building, leaving Finch alone on the steps. Finch was trapped. He couldn't go back inside without looking like a coward, and he couldn't walk past the silent gauntlet of men without his legs trembling. They weren't threatening him. They weren't even looking at him. But their very existence on that sidewalk was an indictment, a public judgment rendered in silence. He was no longer the king of his dingy castle on Elm Street. He was just a small, sweating man, exposed and vulnerable under the bright, unforgiving sun. Just as Finch's paralysis began to set in, two men detached themselves from the silent line and crossed the street. It was Frank and Preacher. They walked not toward Finch, but toward Maria Suarez, who was now out of her van. Microphone in hand, her cameraman setting up his shot. Frank carried a thick, 3-ring binder. He didn't introduce himself by name. He simply held out the binder to the journalist. "Everything you need is in here," he said, his voice calm and even. Maria took it, her reporter's instincts buzzing. She opened it. The first page was a high-resolution, glossy photograph of the melted shoes, a stark image of petty cruelty. Behind it, the binder was meticulously organized, each section marked with a neat plastic tab. There was a copy of Sarah's initial police report, stamped with the words "Civil Matter." There were copies of her unanswered complaints to the Housing Authority, complete with logs of the dates and times of her follow-up calls. There was Sarah's own handwritten log of harassment. The cold water, the illegal rent notice, the glued mailbox. A quiet testament to her mounting terror. But there was more. The next section contained the fruits of Rhino's public records search. A comprehensive portfolio of Finch's properties. It was cross-referenced with dozens of similar complaints filed against him over the past 10 years, from tenants all over the city. A clear, undeniable pattern of predatory behavior emerged from the documents. Complaints of illegal evictions, vermin infestations, and utility shutoffs, all of which had been dismissed, lost, or buried in the same bureaucratic mire that had swallowed Sarah's pleas. As Maria flipped through the pages, her eyes widening, something else began to happen. A woman who lived on the second floor of Sarah's building, who had seen the commotion on the morning news, had taken a bus downtown. Seeing the silent, protective wall of the iron sentinels, she felt a surge of courage she hadn't felt in years. She walked directly up to Maria's camera. "He did the same to me," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "He shut off my heat in the middle of winter because my son's tricycle was in the hall." An elderly man from another Finch property appeared, having heard about the gathering from a friend. He spoke of rats and leaking ceilings, of complaints that were met with threats of eviction. Emboldened by the sentinel's silent vigil and the presence of the camera, the invisible victims of Alastair Finch were finding their voices. They became a chorus, their individual stories weaving together into a damning indictment not just of one cruel landlord, but of a system that had enabled him, a system that had protected him through its own indifference. Finch stood frozen on the steps, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The wall of bikers across the street had not moved, had not said a word. They were merely the fulcrum, the silent point of pressure that had finally caused the dam of fear and silence to break. The truth, raw and undeniable, was pouring into the open, washing over him in a cleansing, devastating flood. The story led the 6 o'clock news. Maria Suarez, with the unimpeachable evidence from the binder and the powerful on-camera testimony of the tenants, laid out the case against Finch properties with surgical precision. The footage was stark. The photograph of the burned shoes, the tearful but resolute faces of the tenants, and the silent, imposing line of 47 bikers standing watch across from City Hall. The visual of the Iron Sentinels was the anchor, a symbol of a community that had decided to draw a line. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. By the next morning, the City Hall switchboard was so inundated with calls from outraged citizens that the system crashed. The mayor's office issued a statement promising a full and thorough review. The director of the Housing Authority, his face grim at a hastily called press conference, announced an immediate, top-down investigation into the handling of all complaints against Finch properties, effectively freezing Finch's entire portfolio. He publicly apologized to Sarah Jensen and the other tenants for the systemic failures that had allowed their suffering to go unheard. The city councilman who had been shaking Finch's hand was forced to recuse himself from all zoning matters pending an ethics investigation. The zoning variance for the Elm Street block was summarily denied. The district attorney, sensing a seismic shift in public opinion, announced that his office was opening a criminal investigation into Alastair Finch for multiple counts of felony witness tampering, willful endangerment, and illegal eviction practices. Finch's empire of neglect, built on the silence of his victims and the apathy of the system, was beginning to crumble under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. For Sarah, the resolution came not with a bang, but with a quiet knock on her door. It was a social worker from a newly energized Victims Assistance Fund. She was offered immediate relocation to a clean, safe, subsidized apartment in a different part of the city. The first month's rent and security deposit, the social worker explained, had already been covered by a large, anonymous donation. The check had been delivered by a courier that morning with no name attached, only a small, embossed emblem of a pair of iron wings. 2 days later, as Sarah packed the last of their boxes, a uniformed sheriff's deputy served Alastair Finch with a restraining order, legally barring him from coming within 500 feet of Sarah or Lily Jensen. The bikers were gone. They had never touched Finch, never raised their voices, never broken a single law. Their victory was not in retribution, but in revelation. They had not sought to punish a man themselves. They had forced a broken system to finally do its job. Justice, when it finally arrived, was delivered not at the end of a fist, but on a piece of paper, backed by the full, awakened weight of the law. 3 months later, the sunlight streamed into a new apartment, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The walls were a cheerful blue, the color Lily had chosen. The scent was of fresh paint and new beginnings, not old despair. Sarah stood at the counter, making sandwiches, a genuine smile on her face for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Lily sat on the floor, drawing. She was wearing a new pair of sturdy brown boots. They were a simple, practical design, but on the heel of each boot was a small, exquisitely hand-tooled piece of leather, shaped into a delicate, intricate wing. The boots had arrived a month earlier, in a plain brown box with no return address. Tucked inside was a simple, unsigned card with the Iron Sentinel's insignia pressed into the paper. It was a gift and a promise. The ripple effects of that day at City Hall continued to spread. Spurred by Maria Suarez's award-winning investigative series, The Landlords of Silence, the City Council passed a raft of new tenant protection laws. They established a tenants advocacy task force, a fully funded, independent body with the power to investigate harassment claims directly, bypassing the old, broken bureaucracy. The task force's hotline number was posted in every apartment building in the city. Alistair Finch, facing a mountain of legal trouble and public disgrace, sold his properties at a loss and left the state. The buildings were purchased by a non-profit housing developer that promised to bring them up to code and work with the existing tenants. The Iron Sentinels faded back into their everyday lives as mechanics, teachers, and contractors. They never spoke publicly about what they had done. Their actions were not for glory, but their legacy was now woven into the fabric of the city. They became a quiet legend, a story whispered among the vulnerable, a reminder that there were still people who believed in a code, who would show up, who would stand as silent witnesses against injustice. The final image was not of motorcycles and leather, but of a small girl in a sunlit apartment. Lily got up from the floor and took a running start across the living room carpet. As she ran, her feet light and sure, the small leather wings on her heels seemed to flutter, as if at any moment she might take flight. The lights in her old shoes had been extinguished by cruelty, but she had been given something more enduring. The knowledge that even when the world seemed dark and indifferent, there were guardians who would ride out to meet the dawn, not with thunder, but with the steady, unwavering light of their own conviction. They had not just given her custom shoes. They had restored a piece of her faith in a world that had tried to steal it.